When 5,000 pounds of steel snapped at 80 miles per hour, the results were apocalyptic. This is the forensic autopsy of the 10 most violent drive rod failures in American railroad history. Steel at speed is not poetry, it is mass in motion, violence at every turn. On the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1, each wheel is 80 inches across. That's nearly 7 feet of steel spinning at 347 revolutions per minute when the engine hits 80 miles per hour. Every turn of those wheels drags a reciprocating assembly: main rod, side rods, crosshead, pistons, each piece forged to withstand forces that would tear lesser metal apart. The main rod alone can tip the scales at over 2,000 pounds. Add the side rods, crosshead, and pistons, and you have a multi-ton mass slamming back and forth with every stroke. Dynamic augment is the killer. That's the hammer blow. As speed rises, the counterweights meant to balance the rods start to betray the machine. Instead of smoothing things out, they lift the wheels off the rail, then slam them back down with a force measured in tons. At 347 revolutions per minute, the pounding comes at nearly 6 times per second. The floor shudders with each blow. The crew feels it in their bones. The sound is a deep, rhythmic thump. It is not music, it is a warning. Here's your nomenclature fact check. The myth says the engine was going so fast, the wheels just fell off. That's fantasy. Wheels stay on the rails. The real threat is dynamic augment. The repeated hammer blow microfractures the main crank pin. The steel heats, flexes, and finally shears. When that happens, the 5,000-pound guillotine drops, not a figure of speech. The entire reciprocating mass, main rod, side rods, pistons, becomes a steel blade, swinging wild, ready to cut through anything in its path. This is not nostalgia. This is the math and physics of terror at speed. At 80 miles per hour, 347 revolutions per minute, and a 5,000-pound assembly in motion, the locomotive is a rolling kinetic bomb. You do not ride these machines, you survive them. The first sign is never dramatic. It's a vibration. The floorboards start to pulse under your boots, not a gentle sway, a deep, bone-rattling shudder. You feel it before you hear it. That's dynamic augment, the hammer blow. The counterweights, supposed to tame the violence, are now betraying you. At 347 revolutions per minute, the pounding is not music, it is a countdown. Crewmen who survived these machines remember the warnings. A metallic ping, sharp and unnatural, cuts through the drone of the drive wheels. That sound is the main rod's death sentence. Sometimes it comes just before the end. Sometimes it is hours in advance. But every old hand knew the language. The ping means a crack is running wild through the crank pin. The shudder means the main rod is starting to flex, heat, and grind metal on metal. There is a myth that the wheels fall off. That's a fantasy for armchair romantics. Wheels do not leave the rails. The real threat is invisible. Dynamic augment lifts the whole locomotive, then slams it down. Every slam sends a shock through the main crank pin. Microfractures grow with each blow. The steel heats up. The oil from the hydrostatic lubricator thins or fails. The piston can seize in the bore. When that happens, the main rod has nowhere to go. The crank pin shears. The 5,000-pound guillotine is unleashed. I've heard it myself. The deep thump turning into a high-pitched snap. The moment the main rod lets go, it is not a question of if someone dies. It is a matter of how much steel gets between the crew and the blade. These are not museum pieces, they are kinetic bombs. Every warning tremor is a message from the iron. Ignore it, and the machine will write your obituary in steel. Dynamic. Augment is not a theory, it is a measured force. Altoona testing. Plant logs show a vertical displacement of 3.1 inches on the PRRT1 at 65 miles per hour. That is not vibration. That is the whole wheel lifting off the rail, then slamming down hard enough to leave dents in the track. The hammer blow is relentless. Each revolution, the counterweights try to balance the reciprocating mass. They fail. Instead, they amplify the pounding. The main rod, side rods, crosshead, and piston act as a single, violent unit. The main rod connects the crosshead to the crank pin. It takes the full thrust of the piston. The side rods link the driving wheels. They synchronize rotation. When the main rod fails, the side rods become levers. They twist, tear, and sometimes turn into track sweepers. Nomenclature fact check. The fantasy says the wheels just fall off. That is nonsense. Wheels do not leave the rail. The killer is dynamic augment. The hammer blow microfractures the crank pin. Every hit drives a crack deeper. Metallurgical autopsies from Baldwin show classic beach marks and striations, evidence of millions of load cycles. Under the microscope, you see the story written in steel. Fatigue cracks radiate from the fillet. The fracture grows with every revolution. At the limit, the pin shears. The 5,000-pound guillotine drops. The reciprocating assembly, main rod, side rods, crosshead, piston, becomes a blade. Nothing in the cab stops it. The inevitability is written in the numbers. At 347 revolutions per minute, the drive rods are loaded and unloaded 6 times every second. The stress at the crank pin fillet is 31,000 pounds per square inch, well above the fatigue limit of 22,000 pounds per square inch for 652 steel. Quartering errors, even a few degrees off, double the vertical force. Hydrostatic lubricator failure means the piston seizes. The main rod has nowhere to go. The crank pin shears. The 5,000-pound guillotine is unleashed. This is not nostalgia. This is physics. The math of violence. The only question is how long the steel can hold. Quartering is the line between control and disaster in a steam locomotive. The main rod links the crosshead to the crank pin, while side rods tie the drivers together. But if the wheels are not set exactly 90 degrees apart, the forces turn destructive. Even a small error, just a few degrees, means both rods absorb the blow at once. Vertical impact doubles, and dynamic augment, already dangerous, becomes fatal. Altoona. Testing. Plant data shows a 10-degree quartering error increases vertical force by 30%. Crank pin stress jumps from 22,000 pounds per square inch to over 31,000 pounds per square inch, breaching the fatigue limit. Microfractures begin, and the countdown to failure starts. The myth says wheels simply fall off at speed. In reality, dynamic augment is the real threat. Counterweights, designed to balance the rods, can lift the wheel off the rail and slam it down again. Each impact drives stress into the crank pin. When that pin shears, the 5,000-pound main rod, the side rods, the crosshead, and the piston become a blade. Nothing in the cab can stop it. Designers did what they could. Counterweights were calculated to the pound, rods measured, wheels quartered at 90 degrees. But even perfect geometry fails if the hydrostatic lubricator falters. That system must feed oil at 30 pounds per square inch minimum to every bearing and pin. Drop below that, and oil thins. Metal grinds metal. The piston seizes, the crank pin snaps. ICC records from Alida, Indiana show a lubricator pressure drop to 5 pounds per square inch. Minutes later, the main rod broke free. The 5,000-pound guillotine fell. Quartering and counterweights are mitigation, not salvation. 30 pounds per square inch is the difference between a living crew and a fatality report. These machines are violence, barely held in check by geometry, oil, and luck. Every number stamped on a steam locomotive is a warning. The force equation, F equals mass times crank radius times angular velocity squared times the sine of the crank angle, governs everything. It is the line between a machine that runs and one that destroys. The reciprocating mass, meaning the main rod, side rods, crosshead, and piston, is not just dead weight. It is a loaded gun aimed at the crew. The crosshead is the only thing keeping the main rod in line. If it wears or binds, the system starts to wander. At 80 miles per hour, a thousandth of an inch of play turns into a hammer. The main rod pounds the crank pin. Side rods spread the violence across every driver. Each revolution, the forces build. The crosshead groans, the crank pin flexes, The main rod strains to break free. Physics does not care about myths. Wheels do not just fall off. The real threat is dynamic augment. Counterweights lift the wheels, hammering down with every cycle. The crank pin takes a hit at 31,000 pounds per square inch. Standard 652 steel gives out at 22,000 pounds per square inch. Anything above that is gambling with fate. Alco tried to outsmart the numbers, switching to a nickel-chromium-molybdenum alloy, A12, for crank pins. It bought a few more cycles, but the Altoona testing plant found microfractures after 800,000 revolutions. The hammer blow does not care about metallurgy. Modern restoration engineers know the risks. Mark Henderson from the Pacific Coast Steam Association recalls fitting a dynamic augment sensor. Even at 55 miles per hour, vertical oscillations topped 1.8 inches. The sensor triggered the lubricator, flooding the bearings with oil. That is the only thing keeping the 5,000-pound guillotine in its cage. The numbers are a countdown. Every revolution is a gamble. Ignore the force equation, and the math will win. March 12, 1935, 2:15 in the afternoon. Crescent, Ohio. The Pennsylvania Railroad. K4-462 races at 68 miles per hour. A side rod snaps at the quartering point. The steel drops, gouging the ballast, smashing 8 cars, and derailing the train. The engineer dies in the cab. The fireman crawls out, leg broken. This is a track sweeper. When a side rod fails, it does not just fall, it becomes a weapon. The pounding from dynamic augment is merciless, lifting wheels, slamming them down, shaking every bolt loose. Wheels do not simply fly off. The real danger is the hammer blow, microfracturing the crank pin until the rod shears and drops, a 5,000-pound guillotine. July 7, 1937, 9:47 in the morning, west of Molen, Illinois. Chicago and Northwestern, 484, Northerner, 72 miles per hour. Side rod snaps at the main rod support. The rod slams the ties, lifts the rear tender, halts the train on an embankment. The crew survives, but the wreckage is twisted steel and splintered wood. September 21, 1938, 4:30 in the afternoon, southwest of Albuquerque. Santa Fe Heavy Pacific at 75 miles per hour. Crank pin shears. The rod slices through the track, kills the fireman, injures the engineer. A micro crack, barely visible, triggers catastrophe. May 14, 1940, 11:02 in the morning. Near Basau, California. Southern Pacific. 484 daylight. Lubricator fails, oil pressure drops, piston seizes, side rod fractures. The rod sweeps the ballast, derails the train. Crew escapes, but the lesson is in bent steel. October 3, 1942, 3:18 in the afternoon. Near Fort Wayne, Indiana. New York Central Hudson at 80 miles per hour. Crank pin microfracture at quartering. Rod drops, tears the track. Engineer killed instantly. The fireman survives. The 5,000-pound guillotine does not forgive. The main rod never simply drops. When it fails, it vaults. On January 11, 1944, west of Cincinnati, a Baltimore and Ohio 484 Allegheny thundered down the line at 81 miles per hour. The counterweights, built to balance the rods, lifted the driver wheels clear of the rails, then slammed them back with over 30,000 pounds of force. The main crank pin sheared. The 2,000-pound main rod crashed down, struck the ties, and hurled the locomotive's rear 12 feet into the air. The engineer died instantly. The fireman was thrown clear, barely alive. The 5,000-pound guillotine is indiscriminate. On June 22, 1945, near Cheyenne, a Union Pacific Challenger 484 hit 84 miles per hour. Dynamic augment cracked the crank pin. The main rod became a vertical spear, tearing through steel ties and opening the track. Both crew members died. ICC investigators found fatigue striations, evidence of millions of microfractures. Even the Challenger's massive wheelbase could not withstand poor quartering and relentless vertical force. On September the 30th, 1946, outside Fort Worth, a Southern Pacific 462. Pacific ran at 85 miles per hour. The crank pin cracked from fatigue, the main rod snapped, punched into the ballast, and vaulted the locomotive 15 feet. The engineer was killed. The fireman survived with a broken leg. The crosshead, meant to keep the rod in line, was destroyed in seconds. On April 10, 1947, near Rapid City, a Chicago and Northwestern Northern ran at 87 miles per hour. Quartering misalignment sheared the crank pin. The rod sliced through the frame. Both crew members were killed. The investigation found quartering error increased vertical force by 30%. The myth says wheels fall off. The truth is in the vault. The 5,000-pound guillotine is not legend. It is a verdict. At exactly 9:32 on June 15, 1937, outside Altoona, the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 became a crime scene. This was not a derailment. This was a mechanical execution. The main rod, built to transfer the full violence of the piston to the crank pin, had been absorbing dynamic augment, hammer blow after hammer blow, at 68 miles per hour. Every revolution, the counterweights lifted the wheels off the rail, then slammed them back down. Each impact sent a shock through the crank pin. The steel was already cracked. The microfracture had been growing, invisible, for months. Nomenclature fact check. The myth says the engine was going so fast the wheels just fell off. That is fantasy. Wheels do not fall off. The real killer is dynamic augment. The counterweights, meant to balance the main rod and side rods, betray the machine at speed. They lift the mass off the rails, then drop it with a force measured in tons. The main crank pin shears. The main rod, nearly 800 pounds of heat-treated steel, breaks free. The entire reciprocating assembly becomes the 5,000-pound guillotine. The engineer and fireman felt the warning. A deep shudder ran through the floorboards. The sound was not music, it was the countdown. Then a metallic ping, the last warning. The main rod snapped upward, vaulting through the cab roof at an estimated 40 feet per second. It struck the engineer's seat. The engineer died instantly. The fireman's thigh was severed. The rod did not stop. It sliced through the boiler jacket, venting live steam into the cab. The ICC docket D 1937-017 reads like a coroner's report. Fatigue striations. Subsurface inclusion. Dynamic augment calculated at 3.1 inches of vertical displacement. The hammer blow was relentless. The 5,000-pound guillotine had no mercy. This is not nostalgia. This is not the romance of steam. This is what happens when dynamic augment, crank pin shearing, failed quartering, and a hydrostatic lubricator running dry all meet at speed. The PRRT-1 at Altoona is the textbook case. The legacy is written in blood and steel. The 5,000-pound guillotine does not forgive. It only waits for the next crack to grow. In 1949, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued the Rod Inspection Order. No more guesswork. Every main rod and side rod crank pin on a high-speed locomotive now faced mandatory magnetic particle inspection. Not just a flashlight and a mirror. This was non-destructive testing, looking for microcracks invisible to the naked eye. The Commission set the fatigue limit at 22,000 pounds per square inch for crank pin steel. Any pin that failed the test or dropped below specification had to be replaced. No exceptions. Every railroad had to file a rod condition statement within 30 days of finding a defect. Failed to report, and the locomotive was pulled from service. The order also forced regular checks on hydrostatic lubricators, a minimum of 5 pounds per square inch. If oil pressure dropped, the piston could seize. That meant the main rod would overload the crank pin. The 5,000-pound guillotine would drop. This was the end of the old ways. The order turned every shop into a laboratory. The myth of wheels falling off was dead. The real killer was dynamic augment, hammer blow, and steel pushed past its limit. Inspection became the only thing standing between the crew and a mechanical execution. Modern steam restoration is not nostalgia. It is engineering triage. Today, every surviving high-speed locomotive gets an accelerometer bolted to the driver. That sensor tracks dynamic augment in real time. If the vertical oscillation spikes, the system dumps oil into the hydrostatic lubricator. Mark Henderson, who rebuilt a 462 for excursion service, called it the only thing keeping the 5,000-pound guillotine locked away. Even at 55 miles per hour, the sensor recorded 1.8 inches of vertical bounce. The data matches Altoona's original test curves. This is why the age of steam ended. No amount of balancing or inspection could tame dynamic augment. Diesel-electric engines replaced steam not for romance, but because they made the force equation irrelevant. The legacy is steel pushed to its mathematical limit, and the cold fact that physics, not nostalgia, writes the final rulebook. People say steam locomotives were elegant. That's museum talk. The truth is in the physics. Dynamic augment is the real killer. Wheels never just fall off. The 5,000-pound main rod becomes a guillotine because counterweights hammer the rail, crank pins develop microfractures, and a hydrostatic lubricator runs dry. Steel snaps. At 80 miles per hour, iron obeys no nostalgia. Respect the limits, or the wrecking crew gets the last word.